Hello everybody, we are talking about the first round series between the Dallas Stars and the Minnesota Wild, doing a series review here, and this one was opened up by Kirill Kaprizov, who got the first goal of the game in the series and ultimately the only point that he would have in this series, surprisingly. But yeah, Roope Hintz and Jason Robertson were able to get some goals back for Dallas as they took a 2-1 lead before Sam Steele, former Anaheim Duck, was able to make it a pair of twos after two. Fast forward to overtime, the first overtime that we got to see here, and Dallas outshot Minnesota 17-6, and we're still not able to capitalize. Hate to see that for a team that really plays well in OT. Didn't matter though for them how well they played, because in double overtime, Ryan Hartman scored the goal for Minnesota to take a big 1-0 lead here in a very exhausting affair. And also this was big too because Joe Pavelski ended up getting hurt, going into concussion protocol after a Matt Dumba hit, and would go on to miss the remainder of this series. So that really put a lot of questions on what Dallas was going to be able to do and how they would be able to handle such a big loss to one of their top line guys going forward for the remainder of this series. Again, Minnesota taking a 1-0 lead. Game 2 was again in Dallas after Minnesota won Game 1, and it was just a crazy game to talk about. In general, there was a lot of penalty minutes, kind of what we would see throughout the series, as these two teams really don't like each other. They're division rivals, and in the first game we saw Max Domi get 12 penalty minutes here, but for the Stars and Wild, just in general, there's a lot of penalty minutes. So we're just going to try to condense this game, talk about what happened, and talk about the craziness that was part of this. So Roope Hintz scored shorthanded goal for Dallas to start the scoring, and of course Dallas was able to get another one before Minnesota responded. Or in general, we just saw this where the Stars were able to take a 2-1 lead going into the break. We then saw 6 goals in the second, 4 of those being by DeBoer's guys, and then the other 2 being by Minnesota. So it was 2 Dallas goals, 2 Minnesota goals, 2 Dallas goals. So you got to see a lot of alternation there, as it is 6-3 in the second period. And then in the third period, we got to see Roope Hintz complete the hat trick early on to end up getting a 7-3 win in the second game between the two teams. But in general, this game was wild because Marc-Andre Fleury really struggled a lot. The two teams were able to get on the penalty, or were on the power play a lot, and Fleury actually had a save percentage of .774, which is not great. We saw 6 10-minute game misconducts issued in the final 5.5 minutes. Again, this was something we would see for better or worse in this series. There was just so much talk about the officiating and penalties being handed out. But at the end of 2 games, it is still tied up 1 apiece. So Minnesota couldn't steal another game in Dallas. Dallas just thankful they're able to win this game, win it pretty comfortably after a wild second period. Game 3, which is the first game in Minnesota. Heading into this one, Dean Evason, the head coach for the Minnesota Wild, decided to go back to Philip Gustafsson in this in net, because the first game he played really well against Dallas. Ended up going Marc-Andre Fleury. I'm not exactly sure why in Game 2. It didn't go particularly well, so they threw Gus the Bus back in for Game 3 as they needed a steady presence in net. They did get that as Matt Zuccarello scored 1 of his 2 goals in the first period as the Wild were up 1-0, and fast forward into the second period, we saw Marcus Foligno score the final goal of the period, as there were 3 total goals, but we saw 2 of those being Minnesota's as they were up 3-1 going into the final frame. And Marcus was a guy that we talked about a lot, you know, in the kind of the series, just throughout the series with a lot of the penalties. He did score a goal here in this one, but unfortunately he would be a big talking point of the series if you were a fan of either team or just in general, because, well, there was a lot of penalties called against Marcus. Now, Zuccarello got his second of the game in the final 20, and Hartman bagged an empty netter as the Wild won at home, and were just 2 wins away from moving on to the second round for the first time since 2015. Game 4, again in Minnesota, as the Wild hold a 2-1 series lead. This is where things started to get really spicy in the series, I think, as neither side was able to light the lamp in the first. But the first goal of the game came thanks to Marcus Foligno getting called for interference. Tyler Seguin, a name that would be a big factor in this series going into it, and then lived up the potential here, ended up being the one that capitalized on the perceived questionable call with a goal on the man advantage. Dadonov was able to give the Stars a 2-0 lead before John Klingberg made it 2-1. So a 1-goal deficit for Minnesota. Foligno was then again in the penalty box, this time for tripping, and again Tyler Seguin was the guy there that made them pay as the Stars led 3-1 late. Freddie Gaudreau did end up getting a goal back on the power play, but it was too little too late, as the talks about the questionable calls were swirling around this series yet again. And the Stars were able to tie this one up 2-2, and they were feeling really good, hopefully going back into Game 5 back in Dallas. Game 5 in Dallas is really just a make or break game for either side. As you know, if you're Minnesota, you're going to be able to go on possibly win Game 6 at home. But if you're Dallas, you know that if you win at home, you could possibly win in Minnesota at Game 6. Things went south pretty quick here with an early 5-minute major in-game misconduct for yours truly, Marcus Foligno, as Tyler Seguin, again, punished Foligno. It's just like if you had a power play for anything Foligno did, Seguin was right there, and that was just part of the thing here going in this, as the power play was able to give the Stars a 1-0 lead. Robertson added a second in the first, Marchment provided a third in the second, and Dellandrea did end up giving Dallas their fourth in the third on an empty netter. All that she wrote here is for this, the Stars ended up winning 4-0 with penalties, again being the focal point in this series. And I think this is really where you start to see a lot of toxicity come out from both fan bases as they're in the comments and they're just going after each other. And to be honest, some of the comments made were kind of embarrassing to where, you know, you got to look back and think, wow, I really said that. But for this one, the Stars end up winning a critical Game 5 as they can go into Minnesota and in this series, instead of having to go back to Dallas for Game 7, potentially get more rest, where Minnesota wants to go back to Dallas because they know if they don't win in Game 6, they're done for the year. In Game 6 in Minnesota, the state of hockey is really hoping that they're going to get a good game here. It's buzzing in a do-or-die game for the Wild. It's not really what you expect, though, as Roope Hintz again mauled them with another goal to give Dallas a 1-0 advantage 6.5 minutes in. Wyatt Johnston, a guy that I talked about in the season preview, I believe, or the series preview, ended up getting his first playoff goal about 14 minutes into this one. Mason Marchment, the Florida Panthers man, myth, and legend, got another one with less than a second left in the second period to give Dallas a 3-0 lead. There was a lot of time where you tried to figure out whether it was able to go in the back of the net with under a second to go, but it clearly did, and Gaudreau did get the Wild on the board with a goal to make it a 2-goal deficit in the third. Max Domi, a guy that Minnesota fans probably hate dearly because of his time in Chicago, his time now in Dallas, ended up getting an empty net goal to win this one 4-1 as the Stars win this series 4-2. And Minnesota's season unfortunately ends where it normally does, that being the first round. The series loss could be explained in a lot of ways. Joel Eriksson-Ek was out for a majority of the series, so their depth down the center was kind of weak. And then they also had to deal with a lot of penalties, Marcus Foligno being tied to a lot of those. Whether or not you agree with those, at the end of the day, Dallas was able to score 4 penalties off of Foligno's penalties alone, and that was not great. Whether or not it's justified or not, these penalties were just problematic for Minnesota. Matt Boldy and Kirill Kaprizov not being able to be the goal scorers they probably needed in this series was rough, especially because Kaprizov just had 1 point in the entire series. Special teams yet again plague the Wild as they go 4 for 22 on the man advantage, and then they go 9 for 24 on the PK, and just more could probably be tied to this loss in this series. Again, going Fleury in Game 2 doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but maybe I'm missing something there. As for Dallas, they head to the second round of the playoffs for the first time since their 2020 Stanley Cup final run, and they will go on to face either the Seattle Kraken or Colorado Avalanche. Don't exactly know what's going to go on there, and kudos to them for dealing with the Pavelski injury. And we got to see guys like Hintz and Seguin really step up when they needed them to. Hintz has really emerged and blossomed, and it seems like every time Dallas gives these guys extensions, they continue to be really good for them as of late, with the Robertson extension, with the Hintz, with the Heiskanen, all that stuff there. Ottinger also did his part in this series too, and ended up closing out the series, ironically, in his home state of Minnesota. So that was that, as Dallas goes on to play in the second round in Minnesota, fails to advance yet again. What are your thoughts on this series? I'd love to hear them down below. Again, I'm trying to be non-partial here. I do think there were some penalties that in the series were kind of questionable, but in general, things were rough. But anyway, leave your thoughts down below in the comments. Also, please make sure to like this video and subscribe if you're new. Everybody stay safe, have a great night, and you go love hockey, alright? Goodbye, Brigadiers and Brigadettes. This is your captain signing off. Have a great night.